You think you lost everything in the divorce until the real estate documents reveal a secret title that proves you own the house. And now the family trying to kick you out is about to lose control of everything. The smell of stale potpourri and judgmental silence clung to the air like a shroud. I stood in the foyer of what used to be my home, clutching a battered cardboard box that held the remnants of my adult life. Across from me, Eleanor stood, a monument to tailored beige and barely concealed fury. Her silver hair was shellacked into an immovable helmet, and her eyes, usually assessing the thread count of the upholstery, were currently fixed on me with the intensity of a laser cutter. "So, this is it then, Mark," she said, her voice the dry rustle of dead leaves. She didn't ask, she declared. "I trust you've packed everything relevant to your existence." Relevant to my existence. That was Eleanor's polite way of saying anything that didn't contribute to the pristine, curated ecosystem she maintained for her daughter, Clara. Clara, my ex-wife, had been gone for 6 months, a quiet, mutual agreement finalized by a judge who clearly hadn't had the pleasure of sharing a Thanksgiving dinner with Eleanor. "Almost everything, Eleanor," I managed, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. The house, a sprawling colonial masterpiece in the affluent suburbs, still felt impossibly large, a museum dedicated to a marriage that had crumbled into dust. I'd lived here for 12 years, pouring my savings, my sweat, and every ounce of my decent nature into keeping this place running, while Clara pursued her passion in the city, and Eleanor ensured I never forgot my place as the supporting actor in their family drama. Good, because the closing papers are signed for the new owners. They get the keys Friday morning. You need to be gone by Thursday night. The less friction, the better for all involved. I blinked slowly. Thursday. It was Tuesday. 48 hours to clear out the last decade of my life, including the workshop in the garage, which was ostensibly mine, but which Eleanor had already started using as a temporary storage unit for her antique lace collection. "Eleanor, I appreciate the notice truly," I said, injecting a level of sarcasm I knew she wouldn't catch. "But I have a few more things in the basement, the filing cabinets, and my tools." Her lip curled, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that spoke volumes. "The basement? Mark, that area is damp and reeks of mildew. I've already scheduled the exterminator for Thursday afternoon to treat the area before the handover. Anything left down there will be considered refuse." Refuse? That's what 12 years of loyalty, commitment, and paying half the mortgage amounted to. Refuse. I looked past her, toward the grand staircase where a single dusty box remained. It was a small, heavy wooden crate, tucked almost out of sight beneath the landing. Clara had insisted we keep it when we first moved in, claiming it was family history from her great-aunt Mildred. It was always locked, and Clara always kept the key on a chain she never wore around the house. I'd asked about it twice over the years, and both times Eleanor had glared at me until I swiftly changed the subject. "I just need to check one last thing in the master bedroom closet before I go," I said, knowing I was pushing it. Eleanor never allowed access to Clara's old wing of the house unless absolutely necessary. She gave a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand. "Fine, but make it swift. And Mark?" I paused on the bottom step. "Don't you dare leave one of your disgusting golf trophies out. They clash with the Federalist aesthetic." I nodded, forcing a placid expression onto my face. I climbed the stairs, not toward the master bedroom, but toward the linen closet near the end of the hall. The real reason I needed access to that wing wasn't the closet. It was the lockbox I'd installed behind the drywall 2 years ago. just before Clara and I started having those endless, quiet dinners where we both pretended we weren't planning our escape routes. It was hidden behind a removable panel, cleverly disguised by a heavy antique mirror Clara insisted on keeping in the hallway, a mirror Eleanor had just asked the movers to wrap yesterday, citing their immediate need to safeguard family heirlooms. I reached the end of the hall. The mirror was gone. The wall behind it was newly painted, glossy and perfect, mocking me. The lockbox was gone, too. My heart dropped into my stomach, a cold, hard stone. Eleanor had found it. She must have discovered it when she was prepping the house for the sale, perhaps even before Clara served me the divorce papers. She knew my contingency plan. But as I stared at the fresh paint, I noticed something minuscule. Something only someone who had spent hours obsessing over the structural integrity of this house would spot. A hairline scratch, almost invisible, near the baseboard molding. It wasn't a scratch from moving furniture. It looked like something had been forced into the gap. I dropped to one knee, ignoring the protest from my aging knees, and felt along the molding. My fingers brushed against a small, almost hidden catch. With a gentle click, a narrow panel, no wider than a standard electrical outlet cover, popped outward by a fraction of an inch. Behind it wasn't the hole for the lockbox. It was a narrow slot, perhaps 3 inches deep, and inside my fingers closed around something cold, metallic, and unmistakably familiar. It was the spare key to the padlock on the old wooden crate downstairs, the one Clara insisted was full of Aunt Mildred's knitting patterns. I pocketed the key, my mind racing. If Eleanor had found the lockbox, she knew I had something valuable hidden. But why would she leave this key here, in plain sight, if she was trying to keep me out? Unless she hadn't found the lockbox yet, and this key was part of a different arrangement entirely. Or worse, maybe she wanted me to find the box. I stood up, brushing off my trousers, the adrenaline starting to pump the slow dread out of my system. I descended the stairs, the heavy crate looking impossibly innocent near the coat rack. Eleanor was standing right beside it now, admiring the grain of the dark wood. Finished up there, Mark? Good. Now, about this monstrosity. The auctioneer said it has negligible resale value, but the movers will take it with the rest of the junk. Actually, Eleanor, I said, stepping toward the crate, trying to keep my voice level, I need that one piece. It's sentimental. She folded her arms. Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills, dear boy. And besides, I'm curious now. What treasures has poor Clara been hiding from her financially illiterate husband for years? She knelt down, producing a small, delicate silver key from her own pocket, the actual key to the crate. She inserted it with a triumphant little twist. The lock clicked open. Eleanor took a deep breath, clearly expecting musty linens or perhaps some forgotten jewelry. I watched her face, anticipating the moment her carefully constructed composure would shatter. The lid swung open, revealing not knitting patterns, but a thick stack of bundled documents tied with aged, brittle twine. Eleanor reached for the top sheaf, her eyes widening as she scanned the header. Her face went instantly, startlingly pale. What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time in memory. I leaned in, my own surprise battling with a rising sense of vindication. I recognized the official government seal immediately. "That, Eleanor," I said, feeling the power shift irrevocably, "is the original deed to this entire property. And judging by the date stamp, it was signed over to a holding trust in my name, not Clara's, 3 days before our wedding." Eleanor didn't drop the documents. She gripped them so tightly the twine cut into her manicured fingers. Her perfect posture seemed to deflate by inches. For a woman whose entire identity was built on controlling narratives and preserving assets, the sight of an unauthorized, decades-old deed was akin to finding a structural crack in the foundation of her entire world. "This is impossible," she hissed, looking up at me, her eyes blazing with a desperate, cornered animal ferocity. "This house was settled in Clara's name, via the prenuptial agreement amendments. You signed waivers. We all saw the estate planning documents signed 5 years ago." "Did we, Eleanor?" I countered, stepping fully into the space between her and the crate. My earlier exhaustion was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "Or did you just see the copies that made things convenient for you? You see, when I married Clara, I was bringing a significant portfolio into the union. Money I inherited from my grandfather. Money your lawyer advised us to keep separate initially, for tax purposes. This deed, the one you're holding, predates all of that. It was an old family holding, something my grandfather managed through a notoriously convoluted legal structure. I forgot about it, honestly. It only came to light when I was digging through old safe deposit box paperwork last month, looking for my passport renewal forms." I paused, letting the information settle. The holding trust, Mildred's Legacy Trust, was something my grandfather had set up in the 1950s. He was eccentric. The house hadn't been legally transferred into the marital estate. It had merely been used as the marital residence under a long-term revocable agreement that, conveniently for me, I had just discovered how to revoke. Eleanor scrambled backward, knocking over a delicate porcelain umbrella stand, which thankfully landed on the thick Persian rug without shattering. "You manipulated this. You're trying to blackmail us." "Blackmail?" I chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "No, Eleanor. I'm informing you of a legal reality. When the closing papers were signed on Monday, you signed them on behalf of Clara and yourself, agreeing to the transfer of property that, legally speaking, now belongs solely to me." Her breath hitched. She scanned the document again, her eyes darting over the signatures, the notary seals, the archaic language. She knew enough law, thanks to years of managing complex trusts for her own philanthropic endeavors, to recognize the authenticity when faced with it. "The new owners," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "The deposit has already cleared. You can't stop the transfer." "Oh, I absolutely can," I said, reaching into the inner pocket of my tweed jacket, a jacket she'd always derided as too academic, and pulling out a crisp, sealed manila envelope. "I've already been busy this morning. While you were scheduling exterminators for your soon-to-be former property, I was having a very productive meeting with my attorney." I placed the envelope gently on top of the deed bundle. It was conspicuously labeled, "Temporary Injunction. Immediate freeze on sale proceeds." Eleanor stared at the envelope as if it were venomous. Her face wasn't just pale now, it was ashen, tinged with a terrifying shade of gray. The helmet of hair seemed suddenly too heavy for her neck. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered. "You'd destroy Clara's life savings for spite?" "Spite?" I repeated, shaking my head slowly. "No, Eleanor. For justice. For the 12 years I spent remodeling your bathrooms, fixing your leaky roof, and sitting through board meetings for charity events I hated, all while Clara looked for meaning elsewhere. You told me to pack my refuse. Now you get to see what actual refuse looks like." She lunged for the envelope, her refined manners abandoning her entirely. I was faster. I stepped back, putting the crate between us. "Don't touch that," I warned. She stopped, panting slightly, her composure shattered. This was the first time I had ever seen her truly afraid. "What do you want, Mark? Name your price for silence." "The price has already been set, Eleanor, and it's not money. I want the house. I want the contents of the safe deposit box I know you controlled for Clara, the one with the actual stock certificates, not the paper promises. And I want a signed, notarized affidavit stating that I was the primary, sole financial provider for this marriage, effective immediately, for my future alimony negotiations." A terrible, slow smile spread across Eleanor's face, chilling me to the bone. It wasn't relief, it was predatory. "You think you've won, Mark? You think you found a loophole the lawyers missed?" She slowly reached down and calmly picked up the original deed again, smoothing out the wrinkles with careful precision. "You found a deed. You found a document. But do you know what Mildred's legacy trust actually contained besides real estate titles, Mark?" She held the document aloft, tapping a corner of the brittle paper with a perfectly manicured nail. "You forget, Mark, that my family has been running these old trusts since before you were born. We specialized in complex asset management, and while this deed gives you the house, there's a clause in the supporting documentation, a very specific, very old clause regarding trust dissolution upon marital separation." She leaned in close, her breath smelling faintly of mints, her eyes glittering with triumph again. "If you move to dissolve this trust for personal gain outside the terms established by the primary beneficiary, which Clara was until yesterday, the entire asset portfolio reverts immediately, not to you, but to the secondary beneficiary of record. And Mark, dear boy, the secondary beneficiary of record, according to the papers I just checked on my phone while you were upstairs looking for your stupid golf trophies, isn't Clara anymore." She let the statement hang in the air, the silence in the grand foyer thick enough to choke on. I felt a cold dread wash over me that was far worse than the fear of homelessness. "Who?" I managed, my throat dry. Eleanor straightened up, smoothing down her immaculate skirt. She reached over and shut the crate lid with a decisive, echoing thud. "The secondary beneficiary is Clara's younger sister, Beatrice, who, as you may recall, is an associate partner at the same law firm handling your divorce proceedings. And she has a very strong, very recent professional interest in ensuring that I maintain control over the final dissolution of marital assets." The name Beatrice hit me like a physical blow. Beatrice. Quiet, efficient, ambitious Beatrice, who I had always dismissed as a slightly more tolerable, if equally condescending, clone of Eleanor. The fact that she was now positioned as the secondary trustee, poised to swoop in and claim the entire asset base upon my aggressive move, meant this wasn't just a legal skirmish. It was a meticulously planned ambush involving the entire female contingent of the Harrison clan. "That's a lie," I stated, the denial weak even to my own ears. Beatrice was a shark, but she wasn't ruthless enough for this level of retroactive maneuvering. Eleanor chuckled, a genuine, unfettered sound of victory that scraped against my nerves. She tapped the phone in her hand, displaying a complex legal document on the screen. "A lie? Mark, you forgot the first rule of the Harrison family. Always read the fine print, even the amendments to the amendments. You only saw the deed. Beatrice saw the trust operating agreement from 1978. When Clara and I reviewed the estate transition plan last year, before Clara decided she needed space, we updated the contingent beneficiaries to ensure asset protection against unforeseen circumstances. She made sure the phrase unforeseen circumstances hung in the air long enough for me to realize I was the unforeseen circumstance. "So if I file this injunction and freeze the sale proceeds," I pressed, pointing at the manila envelope, "the house sale halts. Beatrice takes control of the trust assets, including the equity tied up in this property, and she uses that leverage to ensure Clara gets a settlement that leaves you and her financially untouchable, while I'm left with nothing but the clothes on my back and a very small box of refuse." "Precisely," Eleanor purred, radiating smug satisfaction. "You wanted one last surprise, Mark. Well, congratulations. You found one that seals your fate. You've essentially handed the entire family fortune over to a highly motivated, deeply ethical lawyer who answers directly to me." I looked down at the crate containing the deed, my supposed weapon, and felt the weight of my 12 years of loyalty crumble into dust. I had underestimated them. I thought I was fighting one aging matriarch. I was fighting an entire legal dynasty. "Why tell me this?" I asked, my mind racing for the angle I was missing. "Why gloat? Why not simply let me file the injunction and watch me crash and burn?" Eleanor tilted her head, her expression softening into something almost pitying, which was infinitely worse than her anger. "Because, dear boy, I don't want a messy court battle freezing assets for months. It looks terrible for the foundation dinners. You're leaving anyway, right? You were supposed to be gone by Thursday night. I want you gone quietly with enough liquidity to disappear, but without the leverage to drag my daughter through litigation." She opened the crate again, pulling out a thick, official-looking cashier's check from beneath the deed bundle. It was made out to me. The amount was staggering, far more than my initial settlement offer, and enough to buy a decent house outright anywhere I chose. "This," she said, sliding the check across the polished floor toward me, "is the price of silence. It clears your name, pays for your immediate relocation, and ensures that deed and its nasty little operative clause stay locked in that box until the new owners take possession on Friday. You walk away, you cash this, and you never speak of the Harrison family, this house, or Beatrice's role in corporate asset protection again." The check lay there, shimmering under the chandelier light. It was salvation wrapped in defeat. I could take it, walk away clean, start over. Or I could fight, risk everything, and potentially end up with nothing because I'd missed one final critical piece of the puzzle. I glanced at the check, then back at the crate. If Beatrice controlled the trust, she controlled the assets. But if the trust dissolution clause was the trigger, what was the actual trigger? "What if I don't cash the check?" I murmured, testing the waters. Eleanor sighed dramatically, lifting the check from the floor with 2 fingers as if it were contaminated. "Then I'll have the injunction filed myself, citing your blatant extortion attempt using falsified historical documents, and Beatrice will seize everything, leaving you with nothing but the garbage truck contents by Friday morning." I walked slowly toward the front door, pausing at the threshold. I looked back at the foyer, the place where I had pledged my life, and where now my future was being bartered away. "I'll take the check, Eleanor," I said, reaching for it. As my fingers brushed the crisp paper, Eleanor's phone, the one displaying the trust agreement, suddenly buzzed violently on the nearby hall table. It wasn't a standard notification. It was a flashing, high-priority alert, accompanied by a jarring, proprietary alarm sound I'd never heard before. Eleanor snatched the phone up, her face instantly draining of color once more, but this time it wasn't fear. It was pure, unadulterated shock. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, wide and unblinking. "What is it?" I demanded, suddenly forgetting the check and the immense temptation it represented. Eleanor didn't look at me. She stabbed frantically at the screen, trying to dismiss the alert, but the phone seemed locked onto the notification. No, this can't be happening," she whispered, sounding utterly broken. "The firm, Beatrice's firm, they just filed a motion." "What kind of motion?" I leaned forward, adrenaline surging again. Eleanor slowly lifted her gaze, her eyes glazed over with disbelief and a dawning horror that eclipsed anything she had shown me before. "It's not the dissolution clause," she choked out, her voice barely a thread. "It's an emergency filing. Beatrice just filed to have Clara placed under temporary conservatorship, citing evidence of severe, long-term psychological distress and financial mismanagement, naming me as the primary enabler." The silence that followed Eleanor's last ragged statement was heavier than any sound the grand house had ever held. The implication hung in the air. Her own daughter, her carefully managed legacy, was being legally stripped of her autonomy by her own sister under the pretense of protection. Eleanor stumbled backward, catching herself on the mahogany newel post of the staircase. Her facade, the armor of entitlement and control she'd worn for decades, finally cracked, revealing something raw and utterly terrified beneath. Beatrice wouldn't dare weaponize her anxieties, against me. "Wouldn't she?" I countered, my voice regaining a steadiness I hadn't possessed since the divorce papers landed on my desk. I didn't touch the check. The game had changed too drastically. If Beatrice was moving to control Clara, and by extension Eleanor, then my leverage wasn't just about keeping the house. It was about ensuring Clara wasn't completely ruined by her own family's maneuvering. "You said I was the unforeseen circumstance," I continued, slowly walking back toward the crate, not touching the deed, but circling it like a predator. "But you failed to mention that Beatrice has been preparing for your unforeseen circumstance, the moment you might overplay your hand against me." Eleanor lifted her phone again, her hands trembling so violently the screen blurred. She must have acquired evidence during the initial discovery phase, evidence of my intervention in Clara's finances. She twisted it. "She didn't twist it, Eleanor. She optimized it," I said grimly. "You spent 12 years making sure I was seen as the weak link, the provider who would fade away quietly. You never considered that I might have, just maybe, documented your attempts to control Clara's decisions, especially after the first time she mentioned needing space from your guidance." I hadn't gone digging for the deed because I was paranoid. I'd gone digging because Clara had started leaving cryptic, anxious notes tucked into my old books right before she asked for the divorce. Notes that spoke of her mother pressuring her into investments, notes that hinted at coercion. I had stopped digging when I found the hidden lockbox, assuming that was the extent of the secrets. I was wrong. "You have nothing substantial against me," Eleanor spat, attempting to regain some footing. "I'm the chair of 3 foundations." "Perhaps," I conceded, "but Beatrice isn't targeting you for your foundations. She's targeting you because you're the obstacle between her and full control of the Harrison estate, now that the property deed is legally ambiguous. And she just used my own desperation as the perfect catalyst to trigger her legal claim against Clara." I finally picked up the check, the $1 million silencer. I tore it neatly in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces flutter down around Eleanor's expensive Italian loafers. "I'm not walking away, Eleanor. Not now. If you're going to play dirty with conservatorship filings, I'm going to play dirtier with the property dispute." I turned toward the crate, focusing on the original deed. This document proves that I retained ownership of this property, irrespective of the marital status. You cannot sell what you do not own. This injunction stays in place. The sale is frozen. Eleanor watched the scraps of paper drift to the floor. A strange calm settled over her, the kind that precedes the final brutal move. "You misunderstand the legal landscape you've stepped into, Mark," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Beatrice filing for conservatorship doesn't just stop the sale. It freezes all outstanding financial actions associated with Clara's immediate estate, including the transfer of any assets where Clara acts as a signatory or guarantor, which of course includes the authorization for your attorney to file that injunction in the first place." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "The paperwork you used to file the injunction," she elaborated, a triumphant gleam returning to her eye. "It was filed under the joint marital property agreement. Beatrice's motion names Clara's entire financial portfolio, including all pending litigation related to marital assets, as requiring temporary judicial oversight, meaning the moment the conservatorship order is granted, which it will be, Mark. Beatrice is brilliant at making the judge feel sympathy. Your injunction becomes moot. It's an invalid legal action initiated by a party whose authority to represent the marital assets is now suspended pending review." She took a step toward the door, her confidence fully restored. "You wasted your final surprise, Mark. You played your hand too early without realizing the house was just the pawn in a much larger game. You should have taken the money when you had the chance." She reached for the doorknob, ready to leave me standing amidst the wreckage of my final gambit. "Wait!" I shouted. If the injunction failed, I had nothing. The house defaulted to Beatrice, the settlement vanished, and I was back to square one. Unless... I looked back at the crate, at the original deed, the document that predated everything. If the injunction is invalid because of the conservatorship, then the property deed reverts to the status it held before the marital agreement took effect. "Exactly," Eleanor laughed, opening the door. "It reverts to the trust which Beatrice controls." "No," I insisted, grabbing the crate and hauling it toward the foyer. "It reverts to the grantor, the original owner of record before the trust even existed. The person who held the title before Mildred's Legacy Trust was formed in the 1950s. Eleanor paused, one hand on the doorframe, the other reaching for her phone to call Beatrice. Her confidence wavered slightly. "And who do you think that was, Mark? Some forgotten cousin?" I slammed the crate down, wrenching the deed out one last time. I flipped it over, focusing on the faded, almost invisible script on the reverse side, a notation my initial glance, in my rush to confront Eleanor, had completely missed. "No, Eleanor," I breathed, tracing the faint ink with my thumb. "It reverts to the original, sole proprietor of the land, who legally held the title prior to my grandfather transferring it into the trust in 1958. And that name is still legible right here, above the first recorded transfer." I looked up at Eleanor, my eyes burning with desperate realization. "It's your father's name, Eleanor, your grandfather's brother, the man who died penniless and intestate in 1972. And according to this document, which bypasses all subsequent trust agreements since he had no heirs when he died, the entire tract of land reverts to the only surviving relative listed on the original county survey map from 1935, who was not involved in the trust formation. Eleanor, that person, is my biological father." The air in the foyer solidified around Eleanor, The color drained from her face again, but this time it wasn't the pale gray of shock. It was the stark white of complete annihilation. She wasn't just losing the house, she was losing the bedrock of her entire legacy. The family wealth rooted in her father's side, which she had spent her life protecting from perceived outsiders like me, my biological father, Thomas. A man Eleanor had always dismissed as a distant, inconsequential branch of the family tree. A man who had left the state decades ago under a cloud of vague disapproval from Eleanor's side of the family. I had only learned his true lineage incidentally through Clara's genealogical research for a frivolous party theme. I hadn't known the implications until I saw that faded annotation on the back of the deed moments ago. "That's absurd," Eleanor managed, her voice a rasping whisper. "Thomas was disowned. He had no claim. He died without standing." "He died without standing in your records, Eleanor," I corrected, holding the deed up so the light caught the faded inscription. "But the law doesn't care about your family feuds. This survey map notation, filed long before the complex trust structures were put in place, designates the ultimate reversionary beneficiary in case of total collapse of the trust line. Thomas was alive when the trust was created, and he was the only other living male heir of the original title holder. When he died intestate, that line transferred to his only son." I paused, allowing the weight of the statement to crush her. Me. I'm not just the estranged husband. I am, by the letter of this ridiculously antiquated document, the rightful owner of the ground this house stands on, irrespective of the marital agreement, the deed transfer, or Beatrice's subsequent conservatorship maneuvers. Eleanor looked wildly from the deed in my hand to the quartered remains of the cashier's check littering the Persian rug. The only thing Beatrice's preemptive move accomplished was invalidating the injunction I filed, thereby clearing the path for this far older, far more devastating claim to surface. "You used your position as my son-in-law to investigate things you had no right to see," she accused, though the anger was laced with genuine fear. "I used my position as a man who was about to be made homeless by a family determined to treat me as refuse," I retorted. "I didn't know this existed until yesterday, but now that I do, Beatrice's conservatorship over Clara's assets means nothing to this property. This isn't Clara's property. It's Thomas's legacy, and it's mine." Suddenly, the front door burst open. It wasn't the police or movers. It was Beatrice herself, looking impeccably professional in a sharp navy suit, flanked by two burly men who looked less like lawyers and more like specialized asset recovery agents. "Mother," Beatrice said, her voice cool and commanding, instantly taking charge of the chaotic scene. She took in the torn check, the open crate, and the furious disbelief etched onto her mother's face. "I see you chose not to cooperate with the immediate freezing of the marital assets. That's fine. The court order is on its way, and by 3 p.m. your access to Clara's accounts will be suspended." Beatrice then turned her sharp, professional gaze onto me. "Mark, I advise you to stand down immediately. Any attempt to impede the transfer of the property under the pre-existing sale agreement will be met with immediate legal action for interference with judicial proceedings. We have the injunction stalled. The closing proceeds are safe." I held up the original deed, the brittle paper shaking slightly in my grip, but my resolve was ironclad. "You're too late, Beatrice. You froze the wrong assets." I laid the deed flat on the crate lid, pointing at the original survey reference. Your conservatorship motion freezes Clara's marital claims. It does nothing to invalidate a pre-existing, non-marital reversionary title based on lineage predating the trust itself. I'm not filing an injunction against the sale. I'm filing a notice of adverse claim based on an uncontested, unrecorded property, right dating back to 1935. Beatrice frowned, her composure finally wavering as she glanced at the document I indicated. She pulled out her own phone, bypassing her mother entirely, and started typing rapidly, clearly cross-referencing the old surveyor notations. The silence stretched for a full minute, punctuated only by the sound of her rapid tapping. Finally, she lowered the phone. Her face was a mask of professional defeat. "Mark, you found an obscure, technically valid reversionary clause." "It's not obscure if it's the highest-ranking title, Beatrice. And it is. If you file this claim, the closing is not just delayed, it's dead. The title insurance will collapse. The buyers will sue you for the deposit forfeiture, and the Harrison estate will be tied up in probate litigation for the next decade." "And in that decade," I stated calmly, walking to the door and picking up the one small box of actual personal effects I had brought in, "I'll be living here, waiting for the court to validate the title that proves I owned the land before your father ever met my grandfather." Eleanor finally found her voice, a desperate pleading sound. "Mark, please, we can negotiate. We'll give you the settlement. We'll make sure Clara is happy." I looked at the three of them. Beatrice, calculating and furious. Eleanor, broken and defeated. And Clara, somewhere miles away, about to lose control of her own life to her sister. I had been the weak link, the emotional fool. No more. "There's nothing left to negotiate, Eleanor. You taught me well over 12 years. Always secure the highest possible leverage." I nodded to Beatrice, who was already on the phone, no doubt calling her firm to pivot their entire strategy. "Tell Clara I'm sorry she's going through this, but her family chose sides long ago. I'm just finally choosing mine." I opened the front door, stepping out into the afternoon sun, closing the heavy oak door softly behind me. I didn't look back at the fortress I had spent half my adult life trying to belong to. I just started walking toward my car, the knowledge of that brittle, ancient deed tucked safely in my pocket, feeling lighter than I had in years. I hadn't won a divorce. I had reclaimed a birthright. And I had just turned the tables on the Harrison women so completely that the only surprise left for them was watching their carefully constructed world burn down around the legal technicality I almost missed.